The morning sun revealed what fire had claimed in the darkness. Where Riverside Plantation had stood for 37 years, only blackened chimneys pierced the Memphis sky like broken teeth. Cotton fields stretched in all directions, reduced to ash that mixed with October dew into gray paste. The main house had collapsed inward, its white columns now charcoal stumps. Inside the ruins, searchers would find the remains of Master William Caldwell, his wife Margaret, their 3 children, and 2 house servants who had tried to save them. All the doors had been barred from the outside. All the windows had been nailed shut. In the slave quarters, 43 people had watched the flames consume everything they had known as bondage. When the sheriff arrived at dawn, he found empty cabins and a single name carved into the oak tree that had shaded the overseer's whipping post: Hannah. No one in Shelby County spoke that name aloud for 20 years. But field hands across Tennessee hummed a tune without words, a melody that carried the story of a woman who had chosen fire over chains, silence over submission, and freedom over everything else. October 1849 brought an early frost to the Mississippi River bottoms, turning cotton bolls hard as river stones. Hannah worked the rows with mechanical precision, her canvas sack dragging behind her through mud that sucked at her bare feet. The sound of 43 slaves moving through the fields created its own rhythm, a symphony of rustling plants and labored breathing that had marked her days for 18 years. She was 28 years old that autumn, though she counted time differently than her owners. Not in birthdays or calendar years, but in harvests survived, children born, loved ones lost. Her hands, scarred from years of cotton thorns, moved without conscious thought as her mind tracked more important things. The location of her children, the mood of the overseer, the price of cotton at the Memphis market, because high prices meant longer days and shorter rations. Riverside Plantation stretched across 800 acres of prime Tennessee bottomland, 20 miles south of Memphis. Master William Caldwell had inherited the property from his father in 1834, along with 31 slaves and debts that required careful management. By 1849, through shrewd purchases and natural increase, he owned 43 people and had paid off those debts with cotton money. Hannah had arrived at Riverside in 1831 as part of the estate sale in Mississippi. She was 10 years old, sold away from everything she had known when her previous owner died. The Caldwells purchased her not for her small hands or quick mind, but because she came with her mother, Celia, who was known throughout the county as the finest seamstress west of Nashville. Celia had died of fever in 1836, leaving Hannah alone in a world that valued her only for her ability to pick cotton and bear children who could do the same. She learned to navigate that world with careful attention to the unspoken rules that governed every interaction between master and slave. Keep your eyes down. Move quickly when summoned. Never question. Never resist. Survival meant invisibility. But even invisible people fell in love. The slave quarters at Riverside formed 2 neat rows of whitewashed cabins, each housing 4 to 6 people depending on family size. Hannah shared cabin number 7 with Marcus, whom she had married in a ceremony performed by Brother John, an enslaved preacher who held services every Sunday evening by the creek. Their wedding had no legal standing, of course. Slaves could not legally marry in Tennessee, but the bonds they created among themselves carried weight that no law could diminish. Marcus worked the cooper's trade, crafting barrels for cotton storage. His hands, unlike Hannah's, showed the precise scars of someone who worked with sharp tools and understood wood grain. He had been born at Riverside, knew every tree and creek on the property, carried in his memory the locations of the best fishing spots and the safest paths through the swampland that bordered the plantation's eastern edge. Their first child, Rebecca, was born in 1843. Master Caldwell recorded her birth in his ledger as property, noting her potential value and expected working years. But in Cabin 7, Rebecca was joy made flesh, a promise that life could create beauty even within the boundaries of bondage. Their son, Isaac, followed in 1845. Two children who called Hannah Mama and Marcus Papa, who played in the dirt between the cabins and learned the complex social world of the quarters. They were too young yet to understand the full weight of their condition, too young to know that their laughter existed at the pleasure of people who considered them property. Hannah taught them the lessons their mother had taught her: how to read the moods of white people from a safe distance, which house servants could be trusted with secrets and which carried tales back to the master, how to find food when rations ran short, which plants in the woods could fill an empty belly or cure a fever. Most importantly, she taught them about the railroad that had no tracks, the network of safe houses and trusted guides that could carry determined people north to states where slavery could not follow. It was dangerous knowledge, the kind that could get entire families sold away, or worse. But Hannah believed children deserved to know that walls had doors, even if those doors were hidden. The autumn of 1849 seemed no different from the four that had preceded it. Cotton harvest stretched from September through November, demanding 14-hour days in the fields. Fingers bled from thorns. Backs ached from bent postures. But the work would end with winter's arrival, and the quarters would have time for storytelling, for music, for the small celebrations that made bondage bearable. Hannah had no way of knowing that Master Caldwell's ledger showed troubling numbers that fall. Cotton prices had dropped. Equipment needed replacement. Property taxes were coming due. And slave traders from the Deep South had been inquiring about purchasing young workers for the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. November 23, 1849 began like any other Tuesday. Hannah woke before dawn in Cabin 7, stirred the banked coals in the small fireplace, and began preparing cornmeal for breakfast. Marcus was already awake, running his hands through Isaac's hair while the boy slept. Rebecca lay curled against her father's side, her small hand clutching the corn-husk doll Hannah had made for her birthday. These quiet moments before the work bell rang were sacred. Family time stolen from a system that recognized no family bonds among its property. Hannah had learned to treasure them, to store them in memory against harder days. The bell sounded at 5:30, its bronze voice cutting through morning air still sharp with frost. Marcus kissed Hannah goodbye, headed for the cooperage where he would spend the day crafting barrels from oak staves. Hannah kissed her children, left them in the care of an elderly woman named Aunt Priscilla who watched the quarter's youngest while their parents worked, and joined the line of field hands walking toward the cotton rows. She had picked cotton for nearly 19 years. Her hands knew the feel of ripe bolls, could sense by touch which ones would yield the clean white fiber that brought the best prices. Her eyes could assess a row's potential yield from 50 yards away. This expertise made her valuable to Master Caldwell, but it also made her a target for Overseer James Mitchell, who resented slaves who knew their work better than he did. Mitchell was a hard man who had come to Riverside 2 years earlier when the previous overseer died of fever. He carried a hickory stick that he used liberally on anyone who moved too slowly or questioned his instructions. His face bore the weathered look of someone who spent long days in the sun, but his eyes held the particular coldness of a man who enjoyed having power over others. By noon, Hannah had picked 200 pounds of cotton, 20 pounds more than her assigned quota. The extra would buy her small freedoms, perhaps permission to visit relatives on nearby plantations, or to attend the Christmas festivities that Master Caldwell allowed each December. She was reaching for another bowl when she heard her name called from the direction of the main house. Master Caldwell stood on his front porch, still in his dressing gown despite the lateness of the hour. Beside him stood two men she had never seen before, both wearing the rough clothes and calculating expressions of slave traders. "Walk carefully now." Her feet carried her across the yard between cotton fields and Master's house, each step bringing her closer to a conversation she instinctively feared. Master Caldwell's face wore the neutral expression he used when conducting business, the look that said he was thinking about profit rather than people. "Hannah," he said without preamble, "these gentlemen are interested in purchasing some of our young stock. They've offered excellent prices for Rebecca and Isaac." The words hit her like physical blows. Hannah's vision narrowed, the world reducing to the three white faces in front of her and the sound of her own heartbeat. She had known this possibility existed, had prepared herself mentally for the day when her children might be sold. But preparation meant nothing when faced with the reality. "Master Caldwell," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Rebecca is only 6 years old. Isaac is 4. They're too young to be separated from their mama." One of the slave traders, a thin man with tobacco-stained teeth, laughed. "Young ones adjust faster than older children. We've got buyers in New Orleans who specifically request workers under 10. Train them young, and they never know any other life." The other trader, heavy-set with hands that showed old whip scars, nodded agreement. "These two will fetch premium prices. The girl's got good breeding in her lines, and the boy looks strong enough for field work or house service." Hannah looked at Master Caldwell, searching his face for any sign of humanity, any recognition that he was discussing the sale of children who had been born on his property, who called his slaves aunt and uncle, who had never known any home except Riverside Plantation. She found nothing but calculation. "The price they're offering will cover my tax obligations this year," Caldwell said, as if explaining a mathematical equation. "Business has been difficult. I need the capital." "Please," Hannah said, the word carrying 18 years of careful subservience. "They're babies. They need their family." "Their property," Caldwell replied. "And property goes where it's most profitable." The traders were already walking toward the quarters, already discussing the logistics of collection and transport. Hannah stood frozen on the porch, watching her world crack apart while Master Caldwell returned to his breakfast, as if selling children was no more significant than selling livestock. But the mathematics of cruelty had not finished their accounting. The sound of children crying pierced the November air like broken glass. Hannah ran toward the quarters, her cotton sack forgotten in the field behind her. Other slaves emerged from their work areas, drawn by the same terrible sounds that spoke of family units being torn apart. She found the traders in front of cabin 7. Rebecca and Isaac stood in the dirt yard, holding hands while tears streamed down their faces. The older trader had Isaac by the shoulder, his meaty hand easily restraining the 4-year-old boy. His partner was stuffing Rebecca's few possessions, her corn-husk doll and 2 worn dresses, into a canvas bag. "Mama," Rebecca called when she saw Hannah. The word held all the terror and confusion of a child who could not understand why strangers were taking her away from everything she had known as safe. Hannah rushed forward, but Marcus appeared at her side, his strong hand on her arm. "Don't," he whispered. "They'll hurt you, and it won't change anything." The restraint in his voice told her that he had already tried to intervene, already been threatened, or worse. She could see the fresh bruising around his left eye, the way he held his ribs as if breathing caused pain. "We'll be loading them in an hour," the thin trader announced to the gathered slaves. "Anyone who interferes will be dealt with severely." Around the quarters, 41 people watched in forced silence as 2 children were prepared for sale. This was not the first time families had been separated at Riverside. It would not be the last. But the cumulative weight of witnessed suffering pressed down on the community like humidity before a storm. Aunt Priscilla, who had cared for Rebecca and Isaac every working day of their lives, stepped forward with the quiet dignity that marked her as an elder among the quarter's informal leadership. "Let me say goodbye to these babies," she said to the traders. Not a request, a statement of minimum decency. The heavy-set trader looked to his partner, shrugged. "Make it quick." Priscilla knelt in the dirt and gathered both children into her arms. She whispered something to each of them. Words Hannah could not hear, but knew carried all the wisdom and love that the quarter's elders tried to pass to the young. Protection that could not prevent this moment, but might sustain them through whatever came after. When Priscilla released them, Rebecca ran to Hannah, the child's arms wrapped around her mother's legs with desperate strength, as if holding tight enough could stop the world from changing. "I want to stay with you," Rebecca sobbed into Hannah's worn cotton dress. "I want to go home." "Baby girl," Hannah said, kneeling to meet her daughter's eyes. "You remember what Mama taught you? About being strong? About how love travels even when people can't?" Rebecca nodded, though her tears continued falling. "You take that with you. No matter where you go, no matter how long we're apart, you remember that your mama loves you bigger than the whole world." Similar conversations happened throughout the quarters as other children said goodbye to Rebecca and Isaac, as adults tried to find words that could comfort without false promise. Everyone understood that children sold to sugar plantations rarely survived to adulthood. Everyone knew this might be the last time any of them saw these 2 small faces. The traders loaded Rebecca and Isaac into a wagon along with 3 other children purchased from plantations throughout Shelby County. 5 small figures, huddled together in the wagon bed, their cries growing fainter as the wheels carried them toward Memphis, toward the river, toward lives none of them could imagine. Hannah stood in the yard long after the wagon disappeared. Marcus stood beside her, his own tears falling freely now that the whites had departed. Around them, the quarters settled into a grief so profound it seemed to change the very air. But grief would prove to be only the beginning. 3 days passed in mechanical routine. Cotton still needed picking. Meals still required preparation. The work of keeping 41 people alive continued despite the hole torn in the quarter's heart by the children's sale. Hannah moved through her tasks like a woman walking underwater. Her hands picked cotton, but her mind lived in the wagon where Rebecca and Isaac had disappeared into an unknowable future. She heard her daughter's voice in every child's cry, saw her son's face in every shadow that might have hidden a playing child. Marcus tried to comfort her, tried to find words that could bridge the distance between shared loss and individual anguish. But his own grief ran too deep for easy consolation. He had failed to protect his children. That failure carved itself into his soul with surgical precision. On the 3rd night, Saturday, November 26th, Master Caldwell hosted a dinner party. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the main house to the quarters, where the enslaved community sat in relative silence around their own evening fires. The contrast felt obscene. White celebration layered over black mourning like oil over water. Marcus could not tolerate it. Hannah woke to find him gone from their bed. Through the cabin's single window, she could see him walking toward the main house with the determined stride of a man who had made an irreversible decision. She dressed quickly and followed, knowing that whatever Marcus intended would end badly for everyone involved. Slaves who confronted masters did not receive gentle correction. They received examples that would discourage similar behavior in others. She found Marcus on the front porch of the main house, pounding on the door with both fists. "Caldwell!" he shouted. "You come out here and face what you've done!" The dinner party music stopped. Voices inside the house rose in alarm. Hannah reached the porch just as the front door opened to reveal Master Caldwell flanked by two male guests, both holding pistols drawn from concealed holsters. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Caldwell demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man unaccustomed to being challenged by his property. "You sold our children," Marcus said. His voice broke on the words. 18 years of enforced subservience cracking like ice under spring sun. "Rebecca and Isaac. You sold them to traders who will work them to death in Louisiana sugar fields." "I conducted a business transaction," Caldwell replied. "Those children were my property to dispose of as I saw fit." "They were babies," Marcus said, and Hannah heard her husband's heart breaking in real time. 6 years old and 4 years old. They never hurt nobody. They just wanted to play and learn and grow up with their family. One of Caldwell's guests, a man Hannah recognized as a neighboring planter, stepped forward. "This slave is out of bounds, William. You need to establish control before he gives others ideas." "You're right, Harrison," Caldwell agreed. He looked at Marcus with the cold calculation of a man solving a problem. "Marcus, you've forgotten your place. That's a mistake I can't allow to pass without correction." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of water flowing downhill. Caldwell whistled sharply. Overseer Mitchell emerged from around the side of the house, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Take him to the post," Caldwell ordered. 50 lashes. Make sure everyone in the quarters witnesses it." 50 lashes. Hannah's breath caught. Slaves had died from fewer. "No," she said, stepping forward before conscious thought could stop her. "Please, Master Caldwell. He's grieving his children. Any father would remember his place," Caldwell interrupted. "As should any mother." Mitchell grabbed Marcus by both arms, began dragging him toward the whipping post that stood in the yard between main house and quarters. Other slaves, drawn by the commotion, emerged from their cabins to witness what everyone knew was coming. What would you do? Hannah asked herself as she watched her husband being tied to the post, where so many others had been broken. Run? Fight? Submit? Watch your husband die for grieving his children. The whip was braided rawhide with metal tips designed to tear flesh as well as bruise. Mitchell wielded it with the expertise of long practice. The first blow opened cuts across Marcus's back that began bleeding immediately. The second and third deepened those cuts into wounds that would scar permanently if he survived. By the 10th lash, Marcus had stopped making sounds. By the 20th, his back was more blood than skin. By the 30th, Hannah was praying for unconsciousness to take him before the remainder of his sentence was carried out. The 40th lash opened something vital. Hannah could see it in the way Marcus's body went slack against the post, in the particular color of the blood that now pooled in the dirt at his feet. "That's enough," she called out. her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "You've killed him already." Caldwell turned to look at her with mild interest. "The sentence was 50 lashes, he said. "We don't stop counting because the lesson is learned." The 50th lash fell across a man who could no longer feel it. When Mitchell cut the ropes, Marcus collapsed into the dirt and did not move again. Hannah knelt beside her husband's body and felt for the pulse that was no longer there. Around her, 40 others stood in forced witness to what happened to slaves who challenged the natural order of things. Something crystallized in the silence. Marcus was buried the next morning in the slave cemetery, a section of poor ground beyond the quarters where wooden markers recorded the names of those who had died in bondage at Riverside. Hannah stood beside the grave while Brother John spoke words of comfort that fell like stones into water. "Our brother Marcus has gone home to rest," the preacher said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality required when conducting funerals under white supervision. "His suffering is finished. His soul flies free." Hannah listened to the familiar phrases and felt nothing. The part of her that could find comfort in religion had died beside her husband's body. What remained was arithmetic, addition and subtraction, gain and loss, the mathematics of power. She had lost everything that mattered. Children sold, husband murdered, family destroyed for the crime of loving too openly, grieving too honestly. Master Caldwell had gained nothing but the temporary satisfaction of maintaining control. The money from selling Rebecca and Isaac would cover his immediate tax obligations, but the fundamental problems that had forced the sale remained. Cotton prices, mounting debts, the basic economics of a plantation system that demanded constant growth to remain profitable. But arithmetic worked in both directions. Monday, November 28th, brought Hannah back to the cotton fields. She picked her quota without complaint, answered when spoken to, displayed the proper deference to whites who addressed her. She had learned camouflage during 18 years of bondage. Now she perfected it. At night, alone in cabin 7, she planned. Riverside Plantation's vulnerabilities were numerous for anyone who knew them intimately. The main house's construction, solid brick and timber, but with a wooden roof that would burn readily. The quarters layout, which would allow people to exit quickly if warned in advance. The location of Caldwell's study, where he kept his business records, his money, and the ledger that recorded every slave purchase and sale. Most importantly, the geography beyond the plantation's boundaries. Marcus had taught her about the swampland to the east, the maze of waterways and hidden paths that could conceal someone for weeks if they knew where to find dry ground and fresh water. He had shown her the landmarks that would guide travelers north toward the river, toward the underground railroad routes that could carry determined people to freedom. Knowledge was a weapon when wielded correctly. Tuesday brought the monthly visit from Dr. Morrison, who came to examine the slaves and ensure that Caldwell's investments remained healthy. Hannah submitted to his inspection, answered his questions about her health, gave no sign of the transformation occurring in her heart. But she listened carefully when Dr. Morrison spoke privately with Master Caldwell about the plantation's recent troubles. "The sale of those children has caused significant unrest in your quarters," Morrison observed. "I've seen it before on other properties. Separating families creates resentment that can fester if not properly managed." "I maintain discipline," Caldwell replied, "as recent events have demonstrated. Killing that man may have created more problems than it solved," Morrison warned. "His wife shows signs of distress that could affect productivity. You might consider selling her as well, before she becomes a disruptive influence." Hannah kept her face carefully neutral as she absorbed this news. They were discussing her sale as casually as they might debate the weather. Another family separation. Another destruction of human bonds for the sake of convenience. The arithmetic grew clearer. That evening, Hannah made a discovery that crystallized her plans. While cleaning the main house, she found Master Caldwell's latest correspondence spread across his desk. A letter from the slave traders who had purchased Rebecca and Isaac, confirming delivery to a sugar plantation outside New Orleans. Another letter from a different trader, inquiring about purchasing additional workers from Riverside's quarters. And a third document that stopped her breath entirely. A bill of sale dated November 29th, 1849. Tomorrow. The document recorded the sale of one Negro woman named Hannah, approximately 28 years of age, to a plantation in Alabama known for its brutal conditions and short life expectancy. She was already sold. The transaction would be completed the next day, probably at dawn before she could resist or flee. Everything she had endured, every careful plan she had constructed, would be meaningless by noon tomorrow, unless she acted tonight. Silence fell complete. Hannah returned to cabin 7 as if nothing had changed. She ate her evening meal of cornbread and fatback, participated in the usual conversations about the day's work, showed no sign that this would be the last night she spent among people she had known as family for 18 years. But when the quarters settled into sleep, she began moving with purpose. The first tool she needed was fire itself. The main house's kitchen building stood separate from the family's sleeping quarters, a wise precaution that prevented cooking fires from spreading to the primary structure. Hannah had worked in that kitchen countless times, knew the location of every lamp, every container of cooking oil, every flammable material stored for daily use. She gathered what she needed quietly: 2 ceramic jugs that had held cooking oil, a handful of kitchen rags, a steel striker and flint from the fireplace mantel. Materials that would appear innocent individually, but could create devastation when combined with knowledge and determination. The second tool was time. Master Caldwell retired to his study, each evening after dinner, where he would read by lamplight until nearly midnight. His wife went to bed earlier, usually by 10 o'clock. Their 3 children slept on the second floor, their rooms overlooking the front yard where the quarters were visible. Hannah had memorized these patterns over years of domestic service. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows could be opened silently, which doors would resist or yield to careful pressure. The third tool was geography. The main house sat 50 yards from the quarters, separated by open ground that provided clear sight lines in all directions. But the cotton fields stretched beyond the slave cabins, row upon row of plants that had been harvested, but whose dried stalks still stood 4 feet high. Those stalks would burn like paper when touched by flame. At 11:30, Hannah made her final preparations. She wrote a brief letter using skills Marcus had taught her in secret, and left it on the table in cabin 7. The words were simple but clear. Gone to find my children. Don't follow. Remember me as I was. She gathered the materials she had collected and moved toward the main house with the silent precision of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible. The November air carried frost, but her body felt warm with purpose. What she planned would destroy everything. The house where she had been enslaved, the fields where she had labored, the records that documented her bondage, the lives of the people who had stolen her children and murdered her husband. It would also destroy any possibility of return, any chance of rebuilding a life among the community, that had sustained her through 18 years of bondage. She would become an outlaw, hunted by every authority in Tennessee and beyond. But arithmetic worked both ways, and the ledger she carried in her heart showed balances that demanded payment. The main house stood dark, except for a single light in Caldwell's study. Hannah approached from the kitchen side, where shadows would conceal her movement until the final moment. Her hands were steady as she opened the first jug of oil and began pouring it along the foundation of the building. The oil soaked into the wooden sills with hungry efficiency. She emptied the first jug along the eastern wall, then circled to pour the second along the western side. The building was now surrounded by accelerant, waiting for the spark that would transform potential into reality. But before she could strike flint to steel, a voice called her name from the darkness. "Hannah, what are you doing out there?" The voice belonged to Brother John, the slave preacher who conducted Sunday services and comforted the dying. He stepped from the shadows between kitchen and quarters, his face etched with concern and growing understanding as he absorbed the scene before him. Hannah stood frozen beside the main house, oil jugs at her feet, striker in her hand. The evidence of her intentions was unmistakable. But Brother John's expression showed no judgment, only a weary recognition of what grief could drive people to attempt. "Child," he said quietly, "this won't bring them back." "I know," Hannah replied, "but it will balance the books. And it will get you killed. Maybe others too. I'm already dead. Sold to Alabama tomorrow morning. My children are gone. My husband is in the ground. What's left to lose?" Brother John moved closer, his hands visible and empty in the universal gesture of peace. "Your soul, daughter. Your chance at real freedom. Your life. My life belongs to people who count it worth less than the cost of their taxes," Hannah said. "At least this way. I choose how it ends. There are other ways. Safe houses along the river. People who help slaves reach free territory. I could run and spend every day wondering if my children are alive or dead. I could hide and know that Caldwell profits from what he did to my family." Hannah's voice carried the finality of arithmetic solved. "Or I can make sure he pays for what he took." Behind Brother John, other figures emerged from the quarters. Aunt Priscilla, two field hands named Moses and Abel, others who had been wakened by voices carrying across the night air. They gathered at a safe distance, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing a moment that would define their community's future. "Hannah," Priscilla called softly. "We all loved those babies. We all grieved Marcus. But this path leads nowhere but suffering." "For who?" Hannah asked. "Caldwell's been suffering us for 18 years. Tonight it goes the other direction." She raised the striker, but Brother John stepped between her and the oil-soaked foundation. "If you do this," he said, "every slave in Shelby County will pay the price. They'll tighten controls, increase patrols, make life harder for everyone who's left. Your revenge becomes their punishment." The arithmetic shifted again. Hannah had calculated her own costs and benefits, but she had not considered the broader mathematics of resistance. How many people would suffer for her choices? How many families would face separation or violence because one woman had chosen fire over submission? "What would you do?" she asked Brother John, and in her voice was genuine seeking. "If someone sold your children and killed your husband, what would you do?" "I don't know," the preacher admitted. "I pray I never find out." "I found out," Hannah said, "and now I know." She struck flint to steel. Sparks fell onto oil-soaked rags that caught fire instantly. The flames spread along the foundation with hungry speed, consuming the accelerant she had poured with such careful precision. The main house began burning while people who could have stopped her chose instead to bear witness. Behind Brother John, the gathered slaves made their own calculations. They could raise an alarm, wake the Caldwell family, organize efforts to fight the fire. They could preserve the structure that housed their oppressors and maintain the system that kept them in bondage. Or they could watch 43 years of accumulated injustice burn itself into ash and silence. They chose to watch. But Hannah's plan contained one element she had not shared with anyone, not even herself, until the moment fire began consuming the house where her children had been born and her husband had been murdered. She began walking toward the quarters, toward the cotton fields that stretched beyond them, toward the jugs of oil she had hidden during 3 nights of preparation. The main house would not burn alone. Fire moves with its own intelligence, seeking fuel and oxygen with the hunger of something alive. The main house's wooden roof caught first, flames spreading across cedar shingles that had been dried by 18 years of Tennessee summers. Windows began exploding from heat, sending cascades of glass into the yard where Master Caldwell's children had played just hours before. Hannah reached the edge of the cotton fields as the upper floor became fully involved. Behind her, the quarters erupted into controlled chaos. Some slaves organized bucket brigades that moved with deliberate slowness. Others gathered their few possessions, preparing for the dispersal they knew would follow this night's events. But none pursued Hannah into the cotton rows. She moved between the dried stalks with the methodical purpose of someone executing a plan rehearsed in careful detail. Every 20 yards, she stopped to pour oil from jugs she had cached during the previous 3 nights. The harvested plants stood 4 feet high, their brittle stems perfect fuel for flames that would spread faster than horses could run. Behind her, the main house's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks that rose into the November sky like prayers written in fire. The sound of breaking timbers mixed with shouts from within the burning structure. Voices of people waking to find themselves trapped in a building designed to keep others out. Or in. Hannah had not forgotten the small details that transformed destruction into justice. Every door to the main house had been barred from outside with wooden beams. Every first-floor window had been nailed shut with boards she had quietly prepared during her kitchen duties. The Caldwell family would face the same helplessness her children had felt when strangers loaded them into wagons bound for Louisiana. The arithmetic demanded precision. At the eastern edge of the cotton fields, Hannah struck flint to steel one final time. The flames caught the oil-soaked stalks instantly, beginning a chain reaction that would consume 800 acres of the crop that had enriched the Caldwell family for 43 years. She stood for a moment, watching fire race across the fields in lines of advancing light. The heat reached her face even from 50 yards away, and she could hear the distinctive sound cotton plants made when burning, a crackling whisper that spoke of seasons of labor reduced to ash in minutes. Then she turned toward the swampland that bordered Riverside's eastern boundary, toward the maze of waterways and hidden paths that Marcus had shown her in happier times. Behind her, Tennessee began burning. The screaming from the main house stopped at exactly 12:47 in the morning. Brother John, who had remained in the yard throughout the conflagration, marked the time by the position of stars he had learned to read during 40 years of bondage. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sounds of suffering that had preceded it. 6 people had died in the burning house. Master William Caldwell, his wife Margaret, their 3 children, Thomas, age 14, Mary, age 12, William Jr., age 8. and Caldwell's elderly house servant Celeste, who had tried to unlock a door that would not yield. The arithmetic of fire played no favorites. By dawn, the main house was a skeleton of blackened timbers surrounding a cellar filled with ash. The cotton fields had burned completely, leaving 800 acres of scorched earth that would require years to restore. Smoke drifted across Shelby County like fog, carrying the smell of destruction to plantations 30 miles away. Sheriff William Morrison arrived at 7:15 with a posse of 12 mounted men, including 3 professional slave catchers from Memphis. They found 42 slaves gathered in the yard between the burned house and their own quarters, sitting in silence while smoke continued rising from the ruins of their bondage. "Where's the woman called Hannah?" Morrison demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers from black people. Brother John stood slowly, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. "Gone, sir. Left sometime after midnight." "Gone where?" "East toward the river, sir. But she had several hours' start on any pursuit." Morrison studied the assembled slaves with the calculating gaze of someone trying to determine how much they knew and when they had known it. The timing suggested coordination. No single person could have executed such comprehensive destruction without assistance or, at minimum, willful blindness from potential witnesses. "Who among you helped her?" Morrison asked, his gaze moving across faces that showed nothing but careful neutrality. "No one helped her, sir," Brother John replied. "We were all asleep when the fire started. Woke to find the house burning and Hannah gone." "You expect me to believe one woman did all this alone?" "I expect nothing, sir. I'm telling you what I saw." Morrison dismounted and walked among the slaves, studying their faces for signs of deception. But he was searching for guilt among people who had learned to hide their thoughts behind masks of subservience. Their expressions revealed nothing useful. "Search the quarters," he ordered his men. "Look for anything that might indicate where she's gone or who assisted her." The search yielded little. Hannah's cabin contained the letter she had left, but its contents provided no useful information about her destination. The other cabins held only the meager possessions typical of slave quarters. No maps, no money, no evidence of coordinated planning. But Morrison was not a fool. He understood that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. "I'm placing all of you under suspicion of conspiracy," he announced. "Until we capture Hannah and determine the full scope of this crime, you'll be confined to the quarters under armed guard. Anyone found trying to leave will be shot." The slaves received this news with the stoic acceptance of people accustomed to collective punishment for individual actions. They had expected consequences. The only surprise was that no one had been killed yet. As the posse organized patrols and established guard positions, Brother John gathered the community's children and began the day's lessons. Reading and writing were illegal for slaves in Tennessee, but the approaching chaos made such laws temporarily irrelevant. "Today we learn about fire," he told the children, his voice carrying undertones the adults understood. "How it spreads, how it consumes, how it changes everything it touches." The lesson was about more than flames. The swampland east of Riverside Plantation stretched for 15 miles before reaching the Mississippi River. It was trackless country, where water and land merged in a maze of channels, islands, and hidden passages that could conceal someone indefinitely if they knew how to navigate its dangers. Hannah moved through this landscape with skills Marcus had taught her during stolen hours away from plantation duties. How to find dry ground for sleeping, which plants provided edible roots or berries, how to read water depth and current from surface patterns, how to move silently through vegetation that could betray the unwary with rustling sounds. But knowledge alone could not overcome the mathematics of pursuit. Morrison's posse included professional trackers with bloodhounds trained specifically for hunting escaped slaves. They knew this terrain as well as she did, and they had advantages she lacked. Horses for speed, boats for water crossings, supplies for extended searches. Most importantly, they knew she had limited options for final escape. The river was the only route north to free territory, and every landing between Memphis and Cairo would be watched. She could not remain in the swamps indefinitely. Eventually, hunger or cold would force her toward populated areas where capture became inevitable, unless she chose a different kind of escape entirely. Hannah carried with her a small vial of rat poison, purchased during her kitchen duties and saved for months without knowing why. Now its purpose seemed clear. If capture became certain, if torture and interrogation threatened to expose the people who had watched her burn Riverside, without intervention, she had the means to ensure her silence would be permanent. The vial rested against her chest as she moved deeper into swampland that grew more treacherous with each mile. Behind her, she could hear the distant baying of hounds following her scent through vegetation that held odors like memory. But the dogs were not her only concern. November 29th brought the first hard freeze of winter. Ice formed along the edges of slow-moving water, and the temperature dropped to levels that could kill someone without proper shelter or clothing. Hannah had prepared for this possibility by stealing items from the plantation's supplies, but her resources were limited to what she could carry while moving quickly through difficult terrain. Cold was another kind of arithmetic, calculating survival time against available heat sources. She found shelter that first night in a hollow beneath the roots of a massive cypress tree, a space just large enough for one person to lie down while remaining concealed from casual observation. She had no fire, no warm food, no comfort except the knowledge that every hour of survival was a small victory against the system that had claimed ownership of her life. But cold and hunger were patient enemies that grew stronger while human strength diminished. By the second day, Hannah's movements had slowed noticeably. The rational part of her mind understood that this was the beginning of a process that would end in death unless she found warmth and food soon. The stubborn part insisted that dying free was preferable to living in chains. The dogs found her trail at noon on November 30th. She heard them long before they became visible, their baying echoing across water and through trees with the relentless sound of fate approaching. Behind the dogs came horses, men's voices calling directions. The splash of pursuers who cared nothing for stealth now that they had located their quarry. Hannah reached the edge of a channel too wide to swim, too deep to ford. The opposite bank was 50 yards away, a distance that might as well have been 50 miles for someone already weakened by cold and hunger. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. She pulled the vial of poison from inside her dress and held it up to catch the pale November sunlight. Such a small thing to carry so much finality. 2 swallows would ensure that no interrogation could extract information that might harm the 42 people she had left behind. But as she raised the vial to her lips, a voice called her name from across the water. "Hannah, don't drink that poison." The voice belonged to a man she had never seen before, standing on the opposite bank of the channel with a small boat pulled up beside him. He was white, middle-aged, wearing the rough clothes of someone who worked with his hands. Beside him stood a black woman about Hannah's age, her free papers visible in her raised hand. "My name is Josiah Whitman," the man called, across the water. "This is Sarah Freeman. We're part of the railroad that has no tracks. We've been waiting for you." Hannah lowered the vial but did not speak. Trust was a luxury she could not afford, especially when escape seemed so close. "Brother John sent word through the network," Sarah Freeman explained, her voice carrying clearly across the 50 yards of dark water. "Told us a woman named Hannah would be coming this way. Told us to watch for someone running from a burned plantation." Behind Hannah, the baying of hounds grew closer. She could hear Morrison's voice directing his men to spread out, to cut off potential escape routes, to ensure their quarry could not slip away again. "There's no time for explanations," Whitman said, pushing his boat into the water. "Get in, and we'll discuss details later." The boat reached Hannah's side of the channel just as the first hound burst through the vegetation 20 yards behind her. She threw herself into the craft without hesitation, trusting her life to strangers because she had no other choice. Whitman rowed with efficient strokes that carried them toward the opposite bank, while rifle shots began cracking from the shore they had abandoned. Morrison's men were firing at maximum range, their bullets splashing into water around the boat, but lacking accuracy at such distance. "Stay low," Sarah Freeman advised, crouching in the boat's stern. "They'll keep shooting until we're out of sight." The boat reached the far shore as pursuit arrived at the water's edge. Hannah scrambled onto dry ground and followed her rescuers into thick vegetation that would conceal them from rifle fire, while they moved toward whatever transportation waited deeper in the swamp. "Why?" she asked as they half ran through brambles and hanging moss. "Why risk yourselves for someone you don't know?" "Because slavery is wrong," Whitman replied without slowing his pace. "Because people deserve freedom. Because someone has to help when help is needed. And because," Sarah Freeman added, "you did something that needed doing. Word about Riverside is spreading through every slave community in Tennessee. You've given people hope that resistance is possible." Behind them, Morrison's voice carried across the water as he organized a pursuit that would require boats, time, and coordination his posse had not prepared for. By the time they could mount an effective search of the opposite bank, Hannah would be miles away and moving toward freedom with guides who knew every safe house between the Mississippi River and the Ohio. But freedom came with its own arithmetic. "The 42 people you left behind," Whitman said as they reached a wagon hidden beneath camouflaged canvas. "What happens to them?" Hannah had been dreading this question, knowing that her escape would bring consequences for everyone associated with Riverside Plantation. Collective punishment was the standard response to slave resistance. The innocent would suffer alongside the guilty. "I don't know," she admitted as they climbed into the wagon. "I hope Brother John's wisdom protects them. I hope they scatter before Morrison decides to make examples." "Some will survive," Sarah Freeman said. "Some always do, and they'll carry your story with them wherever they go. Sometimes inspiration is worth the cost." The wagon began moving north through swampland paths that existed on no official maps, carrying Hannah toward a future she had never dared imagine. Behind them, Tennessee burned with consequences that would reshape every plantation in the region. But the mathematics of freedom demanded payment, and the ledger was not yet balanced. Spring 1850 brought new horrors to Shelby County. Sheriff Morrison's investigation had expanded into a territory-wide manhunt that treated every slave as a potential conspirator and every act of resistance as evidence of widespread rebellion. 17 slaves from neighboring plantations were arrested on suspicion of assisting Hannah's escape. 5 were hanged without trial after perfunctory hearings that admitted no evidence beyond white suspicion. 7 others were sold to sugar plantations in Louisiana, their fate effectively sealed by transportation to labor conditions designed to kill workers within 2 years. The remaining 42 people from Riverside faced a different kind of mathematics. Without a master to own them, without a plantation to house them, they existed in legal limbo that made them valuable to anyone willing to pay the county's administrative costs. Brother John was sold to a Methodist minister in Nashville, who promised to use him for church work rather than field labor. Aunt Priscilla was purchased by a Memphis widow who needed a cook and seamstress. The younger slaves were scattered to plantations across Tennessee and Mississippi, their community bonds severed by the economics of human dispersal. But Sheriff Morrison never found Hannah. The railroad that had no tracks carried her through Tennessee, Kentucky, and Indiana with efficiency born from years of practice. Safe houses provided shelter, food, and fresh guides who knew the next stretch of dangerous territory. Friendly magistrates issued false papers documenting her status as a free woman, traveling north on legitimate business. By April 1850, Hannah had reached Detroit, where the Detroit River formed the final barrier between bondage and freedom. Canada lay 900 yards away across water that had carried thousands of escaped slaves to liberty. She crossed on a moonless night in a boat operated by former slaves who risked capture every time they returned to American waters. The Canadian shore appeared in darkness like a promise made tangible, solid ground where no slave catcher could follow. No law could return her to bondage. But geography alone could not heal what slavery had torn. Hannah spent her first year of freedom in a community of former slaves near Windsor, Ontario. She learned to live without masters, to make decisions without permission, to own her labor and its fruits. Basic concepts that required practice after 28 years of bondage. She also learned that freedom came with its own forms of suffering. Every night brought dreams of Rebecca and Isaac. 6-year-old Rebecca calling for her mama. 4-year-old Isaac reaching for his father's hand. Children who might be dead already, worked to death in Louisiana sugar fields, or who might be alive and wondering why their parents had abandoned them. The mathematics of loss transcended geography. Hannah wrote letters to anti-slavery societies, describing the conditions at Riverside and the circumstances that had led to her resistance. Her testimony was published in abolitionist newspapers, where it joined hundreds of similar accounts documenting the systematic cruelty of American slavery. But she never mentioned Rebecca and Isaac by name, never provided details that might help plantation owners track down children who had been sold away. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with allies who claimed to want justice. Instead, she focused on larger truths that needed speaking. Slavery teaches masters that people can be owned, she wrote in a letter published by the Toronto Anti-Slavery Society in 1851. It teaches slaves that resistance requires destroying everything, because nothing can be preserved under a system that denies human dignity. I burned Riverside Plantation because gradual change meant watching my children disappear and my husband die while I remained obedient to evil. The letter reached readers across Canada and the northern United States, adding Hannah's voice to the growing chorus of former slaves who testified about bondage's brutality. But it also reached Tennessee, where it was read by people who remembered the night Riverside burned. 23 years after Hannah vanished into the swampland east of Riverside, a different kind of fire consumed the American South. The Civil War reached Tennessee in 1862, bringing Union armies that proclaimed emancipation and Confederate forces that fought to preserve slavery. The war's mathematics were different from the arithmetic of individual resistance. Battles involved thousands of soldiers rather than single slaves. Victory was measured in territory captured rather than masters killed. But the fundamental equation remained unchanged. Freedom demanded payment in blood and suffering. Union forces occupied Memphis in June 1862, finding a city transformed by 3 years of war. Many plantations lay abandoned, their owners fled, and their enslaved populations scattered by military action or voluntary escape. Among these ruins, soldiers discovered the foundations of Riverside Plantation, still visible beneath vegetation that had grown over blackened timbers. Local residents, both black and white, told stories about the night the plantation burned. But the stories varied depending on who told them and who listened. White versions emphasized criminal destruction of property and the murder of innocent children. Black versions spoke of justice delayed but not denied, of a woman who chose fire over submission and freedom over survival. The truth lay somewhere between legend and documented fact, in a space where individual testimony merged with collective memory. In 1865, a Union Army chaplain named William Hayes interviewed former slaves throughout Tennessee, collecting their accounts of bondage and freedom for a report to Congress. Among his sources was an elderly man known only as Brother John, who had been freed when Nashville fell to Union forces. "Tell me about the night Riverside burned," Hayes requested, his pen poised above a notebook that would preserve testimony for future generations. "Fire has its own justice," Brother John replied. "Burns what deserves burning, spares what deserves sparing. That night, fire took the master's house and left the quarters standing, took the people who sold children and killed fathers, left the people who suffered under their evil. Mathematics worked out the way they should. And the woman who set the fires? Hannah found her freedom. That's all anyone needs to know." Hayes wrote carefully, translating Brother John's words into the formal language required for official reports. But he also preserved the exact phrases in his personal journal, recognizing that some truths required poetry rather than prose. "The old man speaks of Hannah as others might speak of Moses," Hayes wrote. "Someone who led people out of bondage, not through miraculous intervention, but through the simple act of refusing to accept injustice as inevitable." After the war ended, Hannah's story spread through communities of freed slaves who carried it westward as they migrated toward new opportunities in Kansas, Colorado, and California. The details changed with each telling, but the core remained constant. A woman who chose fire over submission, who burned her chains away and vanished into freedom. In 1872, a journalist named Rebecca Thompson published a book about women's resistance during slavery. Her chapter on Hannah relied heavily on oral testimony, since few written records documented individual acts of rebellion. The woman known as Hannah of Memphis represents thousands of enslaved people who chose violence over submission when no other options remained, Thompson wrote. Her story reminds us that freedom was not granted by government proclamation, but seized by individuals willing to pay any price for liberation. But Thompson's research revealed one detail that previous accounts had omitted. In 1868, 2 young women had appeared at a school for former slaves in New Orleans, seeking information about relatives who might have survived the war. They gave their names as Rebecca and Isaac Freeman, and they carried papers, identifying them as former slaves from a sugar plantation that had been abandoned during Union occupation. They were asking about a woman named Hannah, who they remembered as their mother, who had been sold away from them when they were children. The school's director had no information about Hannah's whereabouts, but he preserved their names and descriptions in his records, hoping someday to reunite families torn apart by slavery. Rebecca and Isaac had survived. They had found each other. They were searching for the mother who had chosen fire over separation, freedom over submission. But they never learned that Hannah lived free in Canada, writing letters about justice and remembering their faces every night before sleep. Some mathematics remained forever unbalanced. Today, visitors to Shelby County can find a historical marker where Riverside Plantation once stood. The marker describes the property's agricultural significance and its destruction during civil unrest in 1849. It makes no mention of Hannah, no reference to the children sold or the husband killed, no acknowledgement of the human costs that made cotton profitable. But in communities throughout Tennessee and beyond, people still hum a melody without words, passed down through generations of families who know its meaning without needing explanation. The tune speaks of fire and freedom, of choices made in darkness that transformed everything they touched. They say on November nights, when frost covers the fields where cotton once grew, you can still smell smoke in the air around Memphis, still hear the sound of chains breaking in the wind that moves through trees where no chains hang. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.